Hello, Greg, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me on.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to have you on. I actually watched it was actually another YouTube video where someone was talking about a different subject, but they mentioned your book, Tough. And after reading it, I really wanted to get you on the podcast interview about it. Um, but before we get into the main crux of the interview and what the book contains and discussing it, like I could do with all my guests, could you just say, well, I know who you are, I've said your name, basically your journey up until this point and why you decided to write the book?
Sure. I am a Olympic weightlifting coach. So I coach, world championship level competitive weightlifters. That's been my career now for 15 plus years or so. Uh, Prior to that, did quite a few different things. For example, worked on an ambulance. So I have a lot of varied experiences with a lot of different people from different walks of life. And the book largely came about because in recent years we've kind of seen this uptick in literature, podcasts, social media, all these things kind of pushing these ideas of toughness, mental toughness, resilience. um, and it's been this thorn in my side since I was a young kid, that the sort of conventional popular idea of what that meant never seemed quite right to me, and there were a lot of pieces missing to it, and I think a lot um, of mistaken ideas of what that meant and who it included or who it could include. And so I just, decided, well, I'm going to go ahead and put out my own thoughts on it, and didn't really have those totally clear until I had to put them in writing. So the process of writing that book was pretty interesting. And you have these vague ideas in your head. You don't realize how vague they are until you have to actually explain it clearly to somebody else. So that's where that came from.
Okay, cool. So you said this has been a thorn in your side for a while. Why is that? Is that because you were part because of the lifting or because of any sports you did? Why is it particularly being a thorn in your side? Or was it because of the podcast where you watched them and thought, hang on a minute, that's not what tough is based on your experience?
Yeah, well, I mean, this I should say this. I mean, this dates back to when I was a young teenager. So this predates podcasts by quite a bit. That would have been in the early 90s.
Mhm.
Um, but it was, I grew up, as a kind of a short, skinny kid, really shy, really insecure. And so I think I naturally had this sense that I needed to prove myself to other people. And I did that, by being an athlete, by, being somebody who learned as many different skills as I could. And this idea of value through usefulness and that sort of thing, which I still believe in today, and still pursue those kinds of things. But I think, you look at especially the American archetype of toughness, and it is typically embodied in, big, strong, violent guys. That's the mental
Mhm.
image that most people have. And I remember, interestingly, when my agent was pitching this book to various editors, there were quite a few of them whose response was this like very emotional knee jerk sort of, well, I think the last thing we need in this world is more toughness. Um, which was ironic, considering that had they actually looked at the book itself, they would have recognized that what they were objecting to was exactly what I was objecting to in the book. And so the name is misleading to a large degree, um, in that it is, I don't know how to get into it briefly, but there are so many elements to toughness that accompany the mental, the physical, the emotional, that are misrepresented or not represented at all. And I think that creates this false picture that when you say somebody is tough or somebody needs to become tougher, or how being tough is beneficial for all of us, you get a lot of emotional responses to that because people have bad experiences with what they believe that means, bullies, or misogynists, or whatever, associations we have through our previous life experiences. And so, to me, that as a kid and as a guy growing up kind of in that environment with those archetypes, I always felt that there were parts of that that were valid. Of course, there's always going to be a physical aspect to toughness. Um, but so much of it was based around sort of like deprivation or um like this kind of stoic approach to things where you can't feel or you can't have these emotional responses, and you just kind of sit on your bed with blank walls and a bare light bulb in the ceiling and just grit your teeth and gut it through life, and that's your existence. Like, well, that makes no sense. What is the point of that? So
Mhm.
long story short is trying to put all these pieces together in a way that made sense and that was applicable and understandable and valuable to everyone, not just this little tiny demographic for whom that archetypal tough guy was appealing for whatever reason.
Yeah. So what's the difference then? Because you mentioned bullies there. So what's the difference then between being tough and being a bully? Is bullying more of a perception of toughness and you use it for nefarious means? But
Yeah.
what are the actual sort of differences between the two?
Yeah, there's a difference between being tough and acting tough, right? And that's true for most things, but the toughest people you will ever meet in life, and these are like the true um like special operators or something is a good example because people can kind of understand that to an extent. The gnarliest guys you will ever meet are the ones you will never know that that is what they do for a living unless you actually go after them and ask them repeatedly. They're not out there broadcasting it. They tend to be, fairly reserved, friendly, jovial, um, uh, really easy to hang out with people in my experience. I've known many of them from all the branches. It's the guys who and girls, but primarily guys, we can admit among us are the ones who are telling you or showing you, unsolicited how tough they are, how great they are, how cool they are, how accomplished they are. Those are the ones who are behaving that way in order to, make up for their insecurities, their feelings of inferiority, their this weird emotional compulsion to have people believe they are something they are not because they don't feel that value, that self-worth. And so, there's a lot of interesting psychology behind it, but you'll find the classic bully story is those guys are always cowards, right? And they are so terrified of people finding out that they are fearful or they have shortcomings or failures or whatever, that they are overcompensating to such a huge degree that they end up going so far to the other side and becoming not necessarily physically violent, but emotionally, psychologically abusive, these sorts of things, because that's the way they've figured out that they can, for themselves, kind of cover up those feelings of inadequacy.
Is part of that with bullying that compared to general toughness that bullies are more likely to seek out, for want of a better word, the weak. In other
Oh
words, you'll
yeah,
seek out the weak, but then you won't actually seek out those who you say you're as tough as.
yeah. What's the classic line? Pick on someone your own size, right?
Yeah.
It is, the tough are people who are seeking out challenges, worthy challenges, whether that's climbing a mountain, whether that's, becoming more strict on their nutrition, whatever the case is, they are finding ways to challenge themselves in order to grow, in order to learn, in order to gain experience, to understand who they are, versus trying to basically stage these events, like say picking on a kid in school who's smaller than you and scared of you, in order to kind of it's theater, right? You are trying to put on a show for other people to make them believe you are who you wish you were. And of course, in those cases, who you wish you were is kind of this uh poorly thought out model of toughness or masculinity or whatever it is in that case, but it's bravado and these sorts of things rather than true confidence and ability and Um, the truly tough are the ones who are out there helping other people, and providing support, not pushing other people down so they can climb up on their heads and shoulders.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. Can you be born tough, or is it something you have to go through in order to develop toughness?
It's an interesting question, and I don't know if I can answer that perfectly. I think there must be some sort of genetic or at least epigenetic sort of traits that are passed on, because you kind of see things ancestrally, right? In a lot of cases. But I do think the vast majority of it is developed through what we experience and the way that we experience. And so much of that is dependent on the influences in our life, right? So of course we can have two people who go through the same terrible experience who have completely different responses to it. And I think so much of that is dependent on, how they were raised, or the people they spent their time with when they were very young, who either, if not explicitly taught them things, provided a model, for them to emulate unconsciously. Um, and you look at, say, like, again, going back to Americans, you look through the Great Depression, and you have the generation that kind of grew up as children during that time. um, it was this ability to kind of withstand these horrible conditions, and make do with what you had, work incredibly hard for basically nothing, and even past, once they were adults and even into their senior years, they retained so many of those lessons they learned as 4, 5, 6, 7 year olds, in the way that they approach life, in that they were, frugal and hardworking, but also grateful and respectful, and kind of had this next level, almost spiritual understanding of life that I think a lot of people who haven't had difficult experiences have trouble gaining or appreciating or understanding in any sort of meaningful way. I feel like I
What
went really
quite
far afield on that question. I don't even remember what it was.
No, no, it's all right. It's good. It's good. Because I was going to say, what quite, because I've seen people who are genuinely tough, who you wouldn't necessarily think physically they're not the strongest or look the strongest, but they exude this aura and confidence
Oh,
when they're
absolutely.
around
Yeah.
people. I'm just wondering what criteria um do people need in order to be classified as tough, whether it be physically tough, mentally tough, a combination of the two?
Well, what I would say first is that I don't like thinking of it as an on-off switch, like tough or not tough. It's certainly a gradient, right? In other words, all of us exist on some point in that spectrum, and we can all seek to move ourselves farther toward the toughest end, right? We're never going to reach that perfect end. Um, but the way I broke it down in the book is four basic elements. The first is character. That is your identity. Who are you truly, fundamentally? And the important uh, part of that is, are you secure in that identity? Right? Is it something that you truly are and know at the deepest level, or is it something you are trying to become or trying to make people believe you are? Of course, referring back to the bully sort of situation. The next one is capability. What are you able to do? Right. So this refers to any number of things, from physical traits, strength, power, endurance, the physical durability, to physical skills, to knowledge, intelligence, wisdom, um, and all these things that we gain through continued varied experience and reflection, and this sort of intentional approach to living, where we're not just kind of letting life whiz past us like cars on the freeway. We are, delving into these pieces of our experiences and taking time to reflect on them, and learning from them, and kind of building our toolbox. So that's this very broad, all-encompassing sort of capability. The next is capacity, and that is what most people call resilience. So, what can you withstand? And beyond that, again, it's not just what can you survive, but it's what can you get through in a productive way, right? What can you make it through and then and continue to use to improve your life, to become better, to become more resilient, to become happier, more grateful, more supportive of other people, all these things that we would like to see. How can you use those challenging experiences, potentially devastating, miserable things in order to improve your life over the long term rather than as something that breaks you down, right? And then finally is commitment. Um, and this is kind of the what are you willing to do aspect, right? So you can have all of these capabilities and you can have the capacity to withstand things and be resilient physically, mentally, whatever. But none of that matters if you are not willing to actually implement those things and apply them in real situations, right? So, for example, you can sit in your office and think about, well, if this happened to me, I'm capable of doing this in response and everything would be fine. Well, that's all fantasy until it actually occurs, right? Until you've actually been tested and applied those things and see how you respond, you don't actually know. It's very easy to believe that when it hasn't been tested. And so, this kind of goes back to character too, is that are you someone who kind of collects skills and experiences as a way to impress other people or to kind of create a persona for other people's consumption? Or are you doing it to actually become the person you want to be, you believe you can be, who in these situations, in these challenging times, can actually put those things into practice? And again, we have to be there to actually do it. So we can create challenges for ourselves and improve our abilities and kind of have these periods of testing, but you're never going to get the true test by choice, right?
Mm. Let's talk about those four things and in one at a time. If we start with character, who are you? In many, I'll give you my example. So I'm doing this podcast, I've done writing, I've booked myself, etc. But it wasn't until my 30s that I really felt comfortable with myself because I've been through a lot of stuff. And I'm just wondering with character, how can someone know for sure that they are who they say they are? Because to a certain degree, even adults will put on a facade for people and then something will happen and then that facade will be taken away. So how do we know that who we are is actually who we truly are and we're not just doing it to impress people?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's an important question. And there's a lot of pieces to this, and I think first and foremost, you're right in the sense that you can't be 100% sure about it without those periodic tests, those challenges to your identity, to your character, right? So it's easy to believe you are something, and as soon as that is tested, if that falls apart, you recognize, oh, well, this actually was just a facade, this was a persona. Then that's the time when you have to do that very difficult, uncomfortable, self-examination and decide, is this something I'm going to address? Am I going to pursue the actual process of legitimately becoming this thing I believed I was because apparently I want to be that? Or am I going to abandon that and kind of embrace this other thing that I discovered I am? And I don't think it has to be one or the other necessarily. There's a lot of nuance in there. Um, but character generally it's an everyday thing. It's an everyday thing of ex, you know experiencing different things in life, seeing how you react, being in control of those reactions to the degree that is appropriate and possible, um, and and continually kind of refining those things so that your behavior, your speech, your manner of thinking, um, more and more begin to reflect the person that you believe you are or are trying to become. And in that sense, while during that process, you are acting like the person you want to be because you haven't solidified that character yet. But if that is the genuine effort, is here's this ideal person that I want to become, and you are intentionally going through and kind of monitoring your behavior and thought patterns, and doing everything in your power day to day to reflect, to examine, to make the changes necessary, then you are gradually, incrementally becoming that person. And it becomes less and less of acting, behaving, and more just being. So I do think it's a lifelong process. And again, we go through experiences in life that are totally unpredictable, um, that we can't predict what they are, when they're going to happen, and how we are going to respond. And those experiences are a big part of what guides us into becoming who we are or not becoming who we would want to be. Because, some of us quit, we give up. Oh, it's too difficult. It's easier just to kind of like fall apart here and do whatever. Other times we still do it, but it takes years, it takes lifetimes. And everybody's circumstances are extremely different. For some people, there are plenty of people in this world who are able to coast through life for whatever reason. I don't think that's a benefit in most ways. And for other people, it is struggle from day one there on this earth. And I think the really interesting thing about that is, more often than not, I think that when you encounter people and you are around people who have grown up with that daily struggle, working 3 jobs just to put food on the table, keep the lights on, these sorts of things, so much of the time you meet someone who is just eternally grateful, appreciative for what they have, loving of their family, their friends, these things like that, rather than we see the opposite that we would expect. People who are born into wealth and privilege, so often are these bitter, unsatisfied, unfulfilled, um, kind of like dilettantes who kind of bounce around from thing to thing, just trying to find any sense of meaning and purpose. And they just never find it because they've never had the experiences that force them to do what we're talking about, is, self-examination. Who am I? What do I really need to do to achieve these things? Because everything's just been handed to them and they kind of coast around.
We've again mentioned self-improvement there. Is there a bravery process in that? Because people can say that they want to self-improve themselves, but there has to be a bravery in regards to getting rid of the delusion of doing it. So, for example, you can hang around with people who are just going to basically kiss your backside and tell you what you want to hear and say, oh, that's self-improvement. Or you may change the exterior of you, so you may get a new haircut, get new clothes, etc. But there's a bravery in self-improvement, whether you, I don't know if you agree with us on that, in terms of actually looking deep within yourself, actually, this is what I need to change because this isn't working.
Oh, absolutely. It is to truly do that is a terrifying thing. And that is why very few people do it. And that's exactly why so many people who are seeking self-improvement do exactly as you say. And they will work on the physical, the superficial, um, again, focusing on the way they are perceived rather than who they are, and substituting one for the other. And that you look at so much self-help literature and podcasts, social media, all this stuff, and so much of it is addressing that sort of superficial presentation side of things, rather than doing the very difficult work of asking yourself day to day, why am I responding to this situation this way? And does that reflect who I want to be? Why do I have this emotion in response to this thing that doesn't seem to make any sense? What is this telling me about, uh, my past experiences and how I internalize those and how I need to modify my way of thinking with regard to that so that I can actually respond appropriately in the present? People who blow up at their spouses because a spoon is upside down in the drawer or something like that. You're not that mad about a spoon in a drawer. What are you really mad about, big guy? And it's that kind of thing. And It's what's the classic meme is like guys will do literally anything other than go to therapy. And that is true for so many
Yeah.
men, right? We'll spend our lives rebuilding old cars or like whatever that kind of distracts us from the process. And it's interesting if you talk to people who, for example, spend a lot of time alone in the wilderness, backpackers, hunters, whatever. These are people who have at least a couple times in their lives had an experience where they have had an absolutely complete emotional breakdown in one of those periods. What they are alone, they are isolated because there are no more distractions. There's no Netflix, there's no Instagram and TikTok to kind of keep their brain from going where it inevitably goes without distractions, which is, what is my problem? What is wrong with me? Why am I unhappy? Why am I unfulfilled? um, and so that is why people avoid it. It is truly a frightening experience to be so exposed and so vulnerable when you're digging all the way down to that core of who you truly are.
And then the next one is capability. Now, with capability, and you kind of mentioned there about before about upbringing and whatnot. How do you know you're actually capable of something? Because sometimes, if I'm a lot of people are living day to day, working, trying to put food on the table for their families or maybe themselves. So if you've got that routine, how do you know you're capable of anything else?
You don't, quite
Yeah.
simply. You have no idea. And most likely you're not, if it's not something you have learned, practiced, experienced. And you bring up a great point, and I make this point in the book, I think a couple different times because it is so critical that it is very easy for people to overestimate their abilities in things they are inexperienced with. This is the Dunning-Kruger effect in essence, right? Is the less knowledge you have about something, the more you overestimate your knowledge in that thing. We've seen this in recent years with a lot of things. People saying, "Oh, I did my own research." Well, no, you watched YouTube videos from people who already agree with what you think. That's not research. The scientists are doing research. But with actual capability, just the first thing that comes to mind, like self-defense. Someone's attacking you or your family member. Are you capable of defending yourself? And I think, again, I don't want to beat up on men. I am one. Um, but it is very easy for guys to have this kind of innate belief that we are capable of physical violence in that situation, when more than likely we are way less capable than we believe. Like, I've been watching the UFC for 15 years. I could totally choke that guy out. Probably not. It would be a real short fight, and you'd be on the losing end of that. And so, to your point, you can't know unless you are actually doing these things. And that is a big problem for people who are extremely busy just working. And there are people out there, and when I make all these suggestions like, "Oh, go out there and learn all these things," I'm doing that with the understanding that there are people who legitimately are working, 70-hour work weeks and trying to raise a family. They don't have the time, they don't have the energy. They're not going to go to some weekend course on house framing, right? For the fun of it. Um, the good thing, though, is that these days, so much information is available for free online, right? So you can literally learn anything from construction to, emergency medical, first responder type stuff. Um, if you are willing to put in a little extra legwork at the beginning to make sure you're working with a reputable source, right? Because you can learn a lot of wrong stuff too, by just going to the flashiest looking thumbnail. Um, so there are ways to do it in bits and pieces, kind of like there are apps now where you can learn a new language in these tiny little digestible chunks. And so, is it difficult when you're so busy and exhausted? Absolutely. I'm not saying otherwise. And my hat's off to people who are still out there doing that stuff with such busy, demanding lives and so many responsibilities and obligations. But it is possible to some extent. And I do think that to the extent you can make it work, it is such a valuable, enriching thing to add to your life.
What you said about the YouTube videos and you go in there and get advice, is that a good or bad thing? And what I mean by that is you got certain figures who, whether you agree or disagree with them, they'll give you advice and it almost idealize as a result. But isn't part of not just capability, but actually character that you have to follow your own journey. And actually,
Mhm.
yes, you can follow advice of some people, but you have to make that journey yourself and discover those experiences for yourself. Because it seems to me, I think in this world, especially with YouTube and social media now, we'll follow people's advice online more readily instead of actually experiencing it ourselves. I don't know whether you agree with that or disagree.
Yeah, oh, 100%. And there's a couple things there that come to mind is number one, the experience is key, right? Reading a book about someone climbing a mountain is interesting. It's enlightening. You can learn a lot, but it's not climbing a mountain. The lessons you learn from doing the actual thing are always going to surpass the lessons from an account of someone else doing it in terms of quantity and quality and extent, right? Um, but again, depending on your situation, do what you can do. If you work 70 hours a week just to pay your rent, you're probably not planning an expedition to Everest anytime soon,
Mm.
right? So if you can read the books, at least that's better than just going home and watching some mindless Netflix show. Um, with regard to kind of our tendency to seek out the things that we already believe and already kind of align with our way of thinking, with social media. And the funny thing is the algorithms are built to do exactly that, is to just continue serving us the things that we already like and believe and think and agree with. It's a huge echo chamber. You end up learning nothing. And worse than that, you end up becoming more and more intransigent in your beliefs and your approaches to things because you're just getting it reinforced by more and more people and more sources, while neglecting the vast majority of not necessarily opposing, but differing opinions, approaches, thoughts, experiences that are out there. And so that is a difficult thing with, if you look at the idea of going from a world where we had kind of the information was more sourced from professional journalists, authors, and you had sort of this like gatekeeping process with editors, publishers. Not saying that was perfect, because there was a lot of good stuff that would not get out because it was not commercially viable, but there was some sort of verification of legitimacy, at various points of that process.
Mhm.
Whereas now, you put in an email address, even a fake one. You've got a social media account. You can literally say whatever you want and pretend to be whoever you want to be with virtually no consequences. So much of that stuff is borderline illegal, with regard to exceeding your scope of practice and things like that, with training or medical or science and all these different things. And so that is part of the character components, that you have to have the willingness and the awareness to seek out things that are not necessarily perfectly in alignment with your current way of thinking. And not necessarily because your current way of thinking is wrong, but because those differing opinions are really critical for you to continually evaluate and test your way of thinking. Is this legitimate? Is this correct? Is this most effective? Or do I need to kind of synthesize some of this other outside information into what I am doing and believing? And that's the key, right? Is that we want to take in as much quality information as possible and then synthesize it through the lens of our own personality and experiences into our beliefs and our approach. So yes, you do need to do follow your own path, but you can do that by looking at the paths and the experiences and the results of many other people's journeys, and kind of finding, hey, this makes sense to me. This works for what I'm up to and kind of how I like to approach things. But yeah, if you never challenge what you're doing, the way you're doing it, it never changes. It just gets harder and harder to change if and when you run into that uh, sudden, unpredictable challenge in life that forces you to change. That's where we get the people who fall apart psychologically, emotionally, versus the people who are able to bounce back from that better. Is that, they are willing to say, man, I was wrong about this. I was wrong about who I thought I was. And instead of just giving up and falling apart because now I have this like actual, like real existential crisis, I'm going to pick up the pieces by learning from this experience, put them back together in a way that was better than they were assembled before, and move forward until this next thing where I have to do the same thing.
So now we go into capacity. And obviously, what you say in the book is what are you able to withstand? How do you build up capacity? Because yes, you want to build up a capacity, that resilience, but is there a limit to how much you can have in any one time? And the reason I say that is I'm thinking of if someone disagrees with you, and then some people might take that to heart, and it's about developing that resilience to people who won't always agree with you. There's a difference between that and then say being in a war situation where you've just been conscripted and go to war for the first time, and then you see shootings and you've got PTSD. Obviously, some people might build resilience from that, but that's a real fast track way and damaging
Yeah.
way to do it. So, how how do you basically do it without going from one extreme to the other? Surely there must be a limit the human mind can take at any one time.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I agree with that. And I think what that limit is going to vary person to person. Again, based, I think, primarily on previous experience. Um, so the basic approach is kind of what like the military calls stress inoculation training, is you're kind of appropriately dosing incrementally greater stressful experiences. Um, and at each stage of that, you are teaching or learning tools and methods to better cope with those stressful experiences, right? So you don't take the, baby-faced 18-year-old and send them off to combat on day one and expect everything to work out well. Sometimes it goes okay, but most of the time it does not, whether or not they admit it, right? That is a massive overload of potentially horrific stress. Um, but what you do is you have a period of time where you are basically trying to inoculate them to those stressors, and that's where we have basic training. We have all these other kind of processes that the military has become very good at teaching things in a compressed manner. Not to say that that's perfect and purely effective, but the point is we can replicate things like that in our own lives by um, regularly introducing challenges that are appropriately, difficult and extensive for our present experience and abilities and tolerance, right? So whatever our tolerance level is, the goal is to push our next experience, our next challenge just slightly past that, right? So if we stay right below that tolerance threshold, we don't get any better because we're safe and cozy in this thing that, or I hate the term because it's so overused, but comfort zone. Um, but we can't just blast through that threshold 6 miles on day one, as you said, and expect great outcomes. It's like learning anything, right? You don't take a kid on day one of grade one and start teaching him calculus, right? You teach him numbers, then you teach him basic arithmetic, then you build on those fundamentals to the increasing levels of difficulty and complication. Rather than expecting somebody to be able to absorb it all and handle it productively and effectively.
Yeah, it's interesting in terms of that, like where we go from there, um, how you build resilience in that regard. Because, and actually, that's what I was going to say. Is how we do that historical as well. Because how we consider toughness, say 50, 60 years ago, may not be the same as it is now. So if that's the case, how we build resilience changed? And actually, to widen it out, how has toughness changed over the decades?
Uh, I don't know if I can answer that because I'm only 4.5 decades old. So, uh,
Yeah.
I think though that I think most of the change that has been occurring, at least in my lifetime, has been, and again, overused term, but kind of like the diversification of toughness, I guess would be like a way to say it. In other words, like we're going from this single, rigid, very specific kind of archetypal character, Arnold Schwarzenegger in Predator, big jack dude carrying a belt-fed machine gun. Like that's tough. Like that's the archetype of tough that I grew up with as a kid. And I think that we're seeing more and more uh, people are recognizing that there's so much more to it, and that it is more inclusive in the sense that it is you can be extremely tough, as you alluded to earlier, without necessarily being physically imposing, or even physically particularly capable, because that's only one of many elements, right? So if we look at someone, 75-pound female, might be the toughest person on earth, not because she can lift a car off of somebody, but because she has so many of those qualities that allow her to, effectively, productively make it through the challenging experiences in life, and kind of use those to add meaning and purpose and a sense of fulfillment and contentment. And that's ultimately what toughness is. So you can be extremely tough while maybe coming up short in the scale of certain elements, and perhaps having a surplus in others. And so I think that's the change that I would see much in. I think it goes hand in hand with the recognition. Speaking of PTSD, the greater and greater recognition and acceptance that that is a real legitimate condition that needs to be taken seriously, that people need help with. It's not, oh, this guy was just kind of a baby. He went to war. Now he's all messed up. He came back. He couldn't handle it. Kind of the World War I shell shock sort of thing. Rub some dirt in it, walk it off. I think those things are kind of evolving together as we recognize kind of the complexities of the human brain and the emotional components to psychology, and how our experiences and uh, kind of our sense of self and our sense of meaning and purpose contribute to the way that we do experience things and the way we respond to those experiences.
And then the final criteria you have with regards certainly to toughness is commitment. I know you explained it before, but when you say commitment, do you mean an ability to exude this toughness on a regular basis, or at least when it's required?
I look at it as the ability to do what you are truly capable of in the most trying situations, all the way down to the day-to-day, most mundane, like tedious things that you need to do to live a fulfilling life, to become the person you want to be. And so this is, the typical kind of word for this would be discipline, right? And I just, that again, that word has so many negative connotations to me because of all the nonsense associated with it these days. But it is a discipline in the sense that you are enforcing behavior, that is not the easiest thing to do, right? You are making yourself do things that are more difficult, less convenient, are not instantly gratifying, in for the greater good, for this long-term purpose that you believe is important for you. And so it's that whole range of things, right? It's not just being the hero in the bad situation, but it's being the person every single day who is willing to do what it takes to get to where you want and be who you want to be.
I say this because I started writing for fun back in 2008. I wrote for a website, And then slowly from there, a few years later, I wrote a book and so on and so forth. And that was commitment to one particular skill that I'm now enjoying. And I was willing to play the long game to do that. But isn't one of the things with commitment that some people don't see the light at the end of the tunnel? So they may try and commit themselves to something, but then after a few years, if there's almost traveling without moving, there's no progress. Do they get to a point where they think, actually, I'm not going to keep on doing this because I have the rest of my life to live?
Yeah. Well, the important question to ask in those situations is, are you quitting because you are not willing to do what it takes to get this thing? Or are you recognizing that this thing you believed you wanted doesn't actually align with who you are and what your values are? Because those are two very different experiences. And so, like the point I try to make to people is, um, if you choose to stop doing something or stop pursuing something because it is no longer meaningful to you, then that's not quitting, right? That's making a smart choice to put the limited, very valuable time that you have on this earth into something that is meaningful to you and kind of serves that greater purpose that you feel for life. And so that's part of that self-examination, right? Is this goes back to the character part, and part of that is your values and your motivations. And when I say motivation, I mean it in the strictest sense of the term, is the reasons that you do something, not enthusiasm, right? So why am I doing this? What purpose does this serve in my life? What value of my identity does this align with? And if it doesn't align with my values, why am I doing it? Like, am I doing it because I want my dad to be proud of me? Am I doing it because I'm being forced to by my employer? Like, there are so many different motivations, and some of them are very genuine and meaningful to ourselves. And in those cases, that's what you need the commitment for, is to continue pursuing those through the difficult times, through the times where you feel you're not progressing, in order to get to that point you would like to be. Um, and then recognizing the things where it's, for whatever reason, it is an obligation you can't get out of. You have to do this. For example, going to work, paying your bills, because that allows you to survive and then pursue the things that are meaningful to you, or to support your family or whatever. Um, and then recognizing the things that maybe, when you were 25, you thought, this is what I want to do. This is the greatest thing ever. And then by the time you're 30, you're like, this was a mistake. Or maybe it wasn't a mistake per se, but you, through that 5 years of life experience and learning and meeting different people, you've recognized that your kind of initial assessment of it was not accurate. It's not really what you thought it was. As a perfect example, I worked on an ambulance when I was 20 years old. I thought that's what I was going to do. I was going to become a paramedic. I was going to do that. That's EMS. That's what I wanted to do. I worked that job for a while, and I recognized it's not really what I want to do. And so for me, it wasn't giving up. It wasn't quitting. It was, hey, I had this experience. From that experience, I learned a ton of different things that I still use to this day. But the primary thing I learned was, I need to keep looking and experiencing new things to find what I truly do want to do with my life.
Yeah. So when does commitment, what's the difference between being very committed and almost being very obsessed?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a tough one. I think the way you would have to distinguish between the two is when you cross that threshold into it being harmful, right? So obsession would be taking that commitment to a level where it is causing problems in other parts of your life. For example, are you so intent on becoming a millionaire that your wife and your kids hate you and never want to see you again, right? Are you so obsessed with winning a gold medal that you have now lost your job and you're living in your car? So it's like there has to be that recognition that your life is this very complex interplay of many things. And that even if you are trying to pursue one thing far past anything else, you can't completely neglect all those other pieces of life. They still have to be in play uh, to varying extents for you to be a living, complete person. And so I think that's the difference. And unfortunately, I don't think that's necessarily a bright line in all cases. And I think most people are going to cross it, back and forth multiple times before they kind of figure it out. But yeah, again, that's the self-examination. That's asking those tough questions: is, am I going too far? Is this really what I should be doing?
You mentioned at the start that you're an Olympic weightlifting coach. And actually, I used to do weightlifting when I was a teenager, Olympic lifting, compete. And it made me think about sports in general. How, because obviously is it similar to the outside world where you have like a spectrum of toughness? Or because sports are very almost black and white in terms of what your goal is there like, obviously you got to work on the physical toughness commitment, but also there's like a mental side as well? Or is it a bit more complex than that?
I don't think it's more complex. I think it's almost like I think sport is like a microcosm of life overall. And I know that sounds corny, but it
Yeah.
is it is this kind of one piece of life that has all the pieces of life in it, like more specifically, right? So, yes, you have to have all these physical elements, and you have to continually be training, and kind of just like in life, exploiting your strengths and strengthening your weaknesses, and always figuring out what those are because it's constantly changing. You have to have the mental and emotional sides of things. You have to have that ability to handle wins and losses productively, to learn from them. You have to be able to, especially in team sports, that interpersonal interaction, those sorts of things, those lessons. We always tell all kids, you play sports, that's how you learn, you become socialized. And like most things, if you do
Yeah.
it the right way, yes, that's true. If you do it the wrong way, it's doing the opposite, right? um, but so yeah, I think that's why sport is so appealing for quote unquote tough people, is that it's this kind of simpler version of the overall life experience that they are able to kind of then extrapolate to life and apply the lessons they've learned within that experience to more broader experiences in life.
Cool. Well, we've almost come to the end. I mean, I've thoroughly really enjoyed this interview. Just quickly, a bit about yourself and your writing. Obviously, you've written this book. Have you written any other books since then or planning to?
I've written something like a dozen books, and I think three or four of them were pretty good. But this is the last one I've written, and that came out in 2001 or 21. I have notes and I have partials for several others, and I really would like to write some more. I've just been so busy with other projects, that I haven't had the time or the energy. I mean, you know exactly what it's like. Like, you really have to have that kind of focused time and the energy and the enthusiasm to do a good job. And I'm just not there right now. So one of these days I will get another one out. And the fourth edition of my weightlifting book, the most popular one, that's first on the list though. I got to get that out. That's years overdue. So after that I can do more fun books, hopefully.
Have you started that, or are you planning? Have you got any plans? Like, well, you know when you're going to publish that?
I don't. I have, again, I've been collecting notes on changes and things like that for years, and I've got to get through this year. I got so many big projects this year, and I think I'm going to have some time early next year where I can actually force myself to sit down for a period of time each day and start actually writing it. So I would like to say by the end of next year, but the way things have been going recently,
Yeah,
who knows?
indeed, indeed. If people want to find out more about your work, where can they go to?
Catalystathletics.com is the hub of all the weightlifting stuff I do. Greg-Everett.com is kind of the portal for everything I do. And then on social media, basically Instagram is the only thing I'm really active on, and that is at Catalyst Athletics. Mostly weightlifting, but some other non-weightlifting stuff in there time to time.
Oh, cool. I'll leave those in the description for when this interview goes up. Greg Everett, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Fascinating topic. Thank you so much for coming into the 286 project.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.